What's worse than having the whole town turn its back on you? It's when the very father who once tucked you in at night is the one who pushes you out of the house, all in the name of honor. If the person who's supposed to protect you above all else signed your name over to a stranger, what would you do? Laya Jane Mercer once thought her father, Reverend Isaiah Mercer, was the strongest wall in her life. He was the man who stood at the pulpit every Sunday, eyes alight when he spoke of love, forgiveness, and compassion. But when her belly began to swell, carrying the undeniable proof of an out-of-wedlock affair, that wall didn't shatter all at once. It cracked little by little through cold glances, silent meals, and perfunctory prayers. Then one day, it collapsed completely. News of her pregnancy swept through the town of Cold Mercy as fast as wind cutting through the valley. This was the kind of place where winter could kill you if your neighbors didn't help, and where reputation could save or bury you with just a few whispered words. In Cold Mercy, who your people were and how they behaved was everybody's business. And when the preacher's daughter became the subject behind every half-closed door, all eyes turned toward the white church, with the steeple pointing skyward like an accusing finger. But the real hurt wasn't in the gossip outside. It was in these moments when Laya caught her father's gaze and found no warmth there. The night he learned the truth, when she tried to speak a word in her own defense, he cut her off with a voice heavy as a tolling bell. "You have brought this shame into our house, and into the house of God." The name of the man who'd run Thomas Whitmore was never spoken again. He had left the very night Laya told him, leaving only a scrawled note about urgent business in Denver. She knew she'd been abandoned, but she still believed her father would stand by her. That belief turned to ash the day she overheard his conversation with Mayor Hutchkins. Cade Rollins can handle it. The mayor's voice carried through the crack in the study door. A man like him knows how to take care of strays. "I will not turn my daughter into livestock for another man to feed her father," replied. But in his tone, Laya heard hesitation. Cade Rollins. Everyone in town knew the name, though few knew the man. A towering rancher living apart from the world, coming into town, only when necessary, making grown men step aside and children hide behind their mothers' skirts. Folks said he wasn't cruel, only burdened by losses from the war. But to Laya, he was a stranger. 3 days later, her father called her into the parlor. He stood stiff and tall, his preacher's shoulders squared like a judge ready to deliver sentence. Beside him was the mayor, and in the corner, Cade Rollins, larger than life, silent, holding his hat as if it might break. "Mr. Rollins and I have reached an agreement," her father said, his voice cold as winter wind off the ridge. "You will leave here tomorrow morning. From then on, he will take responsibility for you until matters are settled." Those words, settled, cut like a dull blade, hurting without clean release. She looked at Cade, expecting indifference, but found instead restraint, caution, and most surprising concern. Her father called it a solution, but to Laya it felt like a verdict. There was no why to ask, no choice to make except to leave or be turned out with nothing, not even a family name to shield her. That night she sat by her bedroom window, fingers tracing the worn leather cover of her late mother's Bible, the woman who had once told her, "Love keeps no record of wrongs." But clearly her father had forgotten. Outside wind rattled the roof, and Laya knew that by morning she'd be gone, not by her own will, but by the cold decree of the man who once called her his beloved daughter in prayer. When dawn broke, sunlight crept through the crack in her shutters, but it couldn't warm the chill that ran down her spine. Even the light couldn't touch the sense of being stripped of something vital. Her father waited on the porch, eyes averted as he handed her bag to Cade. No blessing, no embrace, just a curt nod, as if this were all perfectly proper. And so, with the whispers of Cold Mercy swirling in the air, Laya climbed onto the wagon of a man she barely knew, leaving behind not just the house she'd grown up in, but the hope that a father's love could survive her mistakes. She didn't know what lay ahead at Cade Rollins's ranch, only that from this day forward, her father had ended his role as protector and opened a chapter she would have to write on her own. even if her heart was still bleeding. What would you do if you were Laya? When the one who should protect you hands you over to a stranger, is it betrayal or the doorway to something better? Stick around, this story's only just begun. Have you ever braced yourself for the worst, only to be blindsided by the very best? Laya left Cold Mercy in silence, bracing herself for months of loneliness and cold, in a place where even sunlight couldn't warm the heart. On the road to the ranch, the wagon wheels crunched over gravel, the steady clop of hooves filling the spaces Cade Rollins described by the town, with words like closed off and intimidating left in their conversation. He spoke only occasionally, pointing toward a creek or a far-off ridge, his low voice as even as a trail horse's gait. She sat beside him, keeping her distant fingers clutching her skirt, every nerve alert. This man, though not rude, was still an unknown. Who could say what kind of person he'd be once his door was shut in her mind? She'd already prepared for the worst. A damp corner and some shed meals eaten in suffocating silence, and glances full of pity, or worse, disdain. But when the wagon turned down a narrow lane and the ranch came into view, what she saw began to crack the walls she'd built inside. The big log house stood in a clearing, its wide porch catching the afternoon sun. Next to it, well-built barns and sturdy fences, and beyond that, a plot of turned soil ready for planting. Everything about the place spoke of care, not the kind done for appearances, but the kind born of real attachment. Cade helped her down from the wagon with a slow, careful motion, as if he feared hurting her. "Your room's upstairs," he said, carrying her bags ahead. "Windows face east and south, you'll get sunlight most of the day." When the door opened, Laya stopped short. The room was bigger than she'd expected, warm with midday light spilling through two wide windows. A clean quilt lay across the bed, and on the dresser sat a jar of yellow wildflowers, likely picked that morning. But what caught her breath was the wooden cradle in the corner. The wood was sanded smooth, carved with the same delicate patterns she'd noticed on the porch railing. She ran her hand along its edge, feeling the warmth of the grain. "You made this?" she asked, her voice careful, as if afraid to shatter the moment. Cade stood in the doorway, nodding once his gaze turned aside. "It's not the finest thing, but it's sturdy. Safe. I figured you'd need it." Unexpected heat stung her eyes. In town, people avoided her gaze as if her pregnancy were a stain. Even her own father saw only the burden she carried. Yet here was a near stranger who had spent hours, maybe days, making something meant to keep her child safe and warm. "Thank you," she said, trying to steady her voice. "It's the most beautiful gift I've ever been given." Cade only nodded, stepping back. "Rest now. Supper's at 6. But if you'd rather eat alone, that's fine too." There was no command in his tone, only choice, something she hadn't been offered in a long time. That evening, she came downstairs to find him struggling with a batch of bread dough. Flour dusted his sleeves, the table was a mess, and yet his eyes lit just slightly when he saw her. "I'm no good at this," he admitted. "If you'd like to help, I'd be grateful." They ate by lamplight, speaking little, but without awkwardness. Cade asked if she liked her coffee strong or mild, if there was anything she couldn't eat, and whether she wanted to plant more than the usual vegetables. Small questions, but to Laya, they felt like the first time in months someone had asked her opinion about her own life. That night she lay in her new bed, moonlight pouring through the window, listening to the wind in the trees and the soft rush of the creek beyond. Downstairs, Cade's slow footsteps crossed the floor doors, closing gently. Every sound was measured, considerate, and oddly comforting. On her first day here, instead of the cold distance she'd prepared to endure, she'd found sunlight, a hand-carved cradle, and a respect that needed no pleading. It didn't just surprise her, it planted a fragile seed of trust deep inside her heart. If you were Laya, would you dare to believe in the kindness of a man the whole town feared? Or would you keep waiting for the day that gentleness disappears? You think you found a safe place, until an unexpected knock at the door drags your old world right back in. The first days at the ranch passed in such quiet peace that Laya began to believe she'd left behind the judging stares and bitter whispers of cold mercy. She grew used to the mornings flooded with sunlight in her east-facing room, the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen whenever Cade woke before her, and the gentle sounds of life here, the distant lowing of cattle wind threading through the birches, and the rooster Napoleon crowing every time she stepped into the henhouse. But that peace didn't last. That morning the sky was clear. The breeze carried the scent of fresh grass, and spring seemed to have finally settled in. Laya was rinsing her hands in the kitchen after collecting eggs when the sound of hooves approached. They stopped out front, followed by a knock, firm, deliberate, not the kind a neighbor used. This was the knock of someone carrying authority. Cade opened the door. On the porch stood 3 men, Doctor. Morrison, thin and bespectacled, the same man who had confirmed her pregnancy. A stranger in a long ash-gray coat with wire-rimmed glasses and a thick ledger, and a deputy with a flat expression, one hand resting casually on his holster. "Mr. Rollins," the stranger said, voice sharp as cold steel. "Hartwell inspector from the Capitol. We've received complaints regarding Miss Mercer's living arrangements." Laya saw Cade's eyes darken for a moment, though his voice stayed calm. "She lives in my home. She's well cared for. What's the problem?" "The problem," Hartwell replied, letting his gaze drift past the doorway into the house, "is that the public believes this arrangement is improper. A man and a woman unmarried living together under special circumstances is bound to cause misunderstandings." The last word stretched out heavy with suspicion. Laya felt a chill climb her spine, not from the wind on the porch, but from the way the 3 men looked into the house, as though searching for proof of sin. Dr. Morrison spoke next, his tone not harsh, but tinged with judgment. "We need to confirm that Miss Mercer is here entirely of her own will, and that her health isn't being compromised by anything other than the pregnancy." Cade stepped aside. "She can speak for herself." In the sitting room, Laya sat straight in her chair, hands clasped to hide their tremor. Hartwell opened his ledger and began a long series of questions, where she slept, whether she had her own room, how Cade treated her, whether she'd ever been coerced. Each question felt like a needle pricking at her pride, while trying to uncover some imagined wrongdoing. Some have claimed, Hartwell said, glancing down at his notes before looking her square in the eye, that you and Mr. Rollins were intimate before any legal marriage took place. Do you confirm or deny this? Heat rushed to her face. The question was nothing short of a slap. "I deny it. And let me be clear, I'm here because I choose to be here. Mr. Rollins treats me with more respect than many in town ever have." Cade leaned against the doorway, shoulders tense, but let her continue. "If your purpose is to find a reason to take me away from this place," Laya said, voice steady, "now you're going to fail. This is my home, and I am safe here." The deputy exchanged a look with Hartwell, while Dr. Morrison cleared his throat, clearly unsettled by her forthrightness. Still, they insisted on inspecting her room, checking the bed, the wardrobe, even the cradle. Hartwell scribbled notes the entire time, his cramped handwriting, boxing every detail into the record. Finally, after nearly an hour, Morrison said, "I see no signs she's being mistreated." Hartwell shut his ledger, but his gray eyes still held a flicker of doubt. "We'll report back. But remember, sometimes it's not just the truth that matters, but what people think is the truth." The words felt more like a warning than a conclusion. When the door closed behind them, Laya could still hear the retreating hoofbeats, leaving behind a heavy silence in the house. She exhaled her whole body, feeling as though it had weathered a storm. Cade came to sit beside her, his broad, warm hand resting lightly over hers. "You did well," he said, "but this is only the beginning. If someone's determined to find fault, they'll keep looking." Laya glanced out the window where the late afternoon sun still spread gold over the fields, beauty that felt almost mocking in the wake of those cold accusations. Inside her, a knot of unease began to grow. The storm outside had found a way in, and she knew there would be more winds coming. If you'd found a place that finally felt safe, would you stand and fight to protect it, or leave before the storm breaks? Some letters don't carry news, only the musty scent of a past you've tried to bury deep. The wind from Hartwell's so-called moral inspection had barely died down, when one late afternoon, with the sunlight turning the fields to honey, Cade came back from town, wearing an unusual look. In his hand was a worn, creased envelope, its edges frayed as if it had traveled hundreds of dusty miles and passed through hands reluctant to keep it long. He set it on the kitchen table where Laya was peeling potatoes for supper. "Letter for you," he said, his voice low and deliberate, as though weighing each word. Laya wiped her hands on her apron, feeling her heartbeat slow. One glance at the scrawled handwriting on the envelope told her exactly who it was from, despite the 8 months since the night he left. Thomas Whitmore was written in the top corner, a name like an old scar that still stung when touched. She hesitated, then slipped her finger under the seal. Inside were several folded pages carrying the faint scent of ink and stale tobacco, pulling with them memories of summer afternoons down by the river, when Thomas had held her hand and talked about his big plans for the future. But now the words were no promises. They were cold commands. "Laya, I know your situation. News in Cold Mercy travels faster than the flu, and I've heard you're living at Cade Rollins' place. I don't need to explain to you what his reputation is. I'm the father of that child, and I have rights. You need to leave his house immediately before this goes too far. I'll make arrangements to bring you back. Not a single apology. Not one question about her health. Only the phrase 'I have rights' repeated like the toll of a hammer, as if the 8 months of silence had never happened." Laya read it again, then folded it carefully, her hand trembling just slightly. She felt not only anger, but a strange kind of sadness. Sadness for having once loved a man who now inspired only emptiness. Cade stood in the corner watching without intruding. "Want me to read it?" he asked, calm, as though he already guessed what it said. She shook her head. "No. He just wants me to leave. Says he'll bring me back." A beat of silence. Then Cade asked, "Do you want that?" Her answer came instantly. "No. I've gone back to my father's house, back to that town, and nowhere has been home. Here is—" She stopped, realizing she'd said too much, but Cade only gave a small nod, as if he understood all of it. She slid the letter back into its envelope, planning to bury it at the bottom of some drawer where the scent of tobacco and the weight of old memories couldn't escape. But 2 days later, another letter came, this time by express courier, sealed with the stamp of a law office in Denver. Inside was a formal legal notice demanding Laya cease cohabitation of an unlawful nature with Mr. Cade Rollins, and informing her that Thomas intended to pursue all necessary measures to secure his rights regarding the child. The paper spoke in the cold, precise voice of the law, but beneath it, Laya recognized Thomas's hand, the same old possessiveness, dressed up in proper words. Cade read this one with her. When he folded the page, his large hands tightened until his knuckles went white. "He's not going to force you anywhere," Cade said, voice as solid as oak. "But you need to be ready. This could be the start of a long fight." Laya looked out the window. The sunset was painting the fields in deep copper, beautiful enough to hold on to, but the migrating birds still flew in their straight lines south. She knew Thomas didn't just want a right. He wanted to erase the life she'd begun to build here. That night, as Cade stoked the fire, Laya sat in her wooden chair, one hand resting on her belly. The baby kicked lightly, as if to remind her that the future couldn't be pulled back into the past with a few sheets of paper. She knew she wouldn't go back, but she also knew the storms ahead wouldn't come. Just from gossip, they would come from a man who once held her hand, once whispered, "I love you," and was now willing to use anything to take away what mattered most. Some decisions aren't born of dreams. They're forged from the will to protect what matters most. In the days after the letter from the law office, the air in the house carried a quiet weight. Neither Laya nor Cade spoke of it, but both knew Thomas would not stop at a few lines of ink. Gossip in town, the inspector's scrutiny, and now the pressure from a man claiming rights, all of it felt like a tightening noose. One evening, when the fire in the stove had burned down to glowing embers, Cade set his coffee cup on the table and sat across from Laya. The golden lamplight drew sharp shadows along his jaw, and he was silent for a long moment, as though measuring every word before letting it leave his mouth. "Laya," he began, his voice steady and low, "I think it's time we do something. Not for the town, not to answer Thomas, but to protect you and the baby. We should get married." She looked up, her heart skipping a beat. This proposal carried no roses, no romantic declarations, but it held something else: resolve, safety. Cade didn't see her as a burden to be hidden away. He saw her as someone who belonged here, someone worth protecting with his name. "Are you sure?" Laya asked, fingers tightening in her lap. "Sure," Cade replied without hesitation. "If you agree, we'll go to Copper Falls in the morning. Judge Harrison's a straight shooter. He'll have the papers done right away. Then no one can call what we have unlawful, or question your right to the child." Laya didn't need long to decide. She knew that to Thomas, any uncertainty could be turned into a weapon. A marriage certificate wasn't just a formality, it was a shield. But more than that, the way Cade looked at her when he spoke told her this wasn't a reluctant sacrifice. It was a choice he wanted to make. The next morning, just after dawn, they set out. The early spring air was still cool, but the sun was already spilling gold across the hilltops. The wagon wheels bumped over the dirt road past stands of pine and the glint of a silver stream. They spoke little, but the silence between them carried no strain. Copper Falls was quiet when they arrived. Judge Harrison, an older man with a silver beard and keen eyes, greeted them with a firm handshake. Cade explained the matter simply and clearly, his voice free of hesitation. The ceremony took place in the modest wooden room of the town hall. There was no music, no guests, only sunlight streaming through the window falling across Laya's simple dress and Cade's dark coat. As the judge spoke the vows, Cade's hand closed gently over hers, the weight of his grip, steady and sure. "I now pronounce you husband and wife under the law of this territory," Judge Harrison said, his voice ringing with finality. He signed the certificate, then handed them a fresh copy, the ink still damp. Laya looked at the paper in her hands, a thin sheet but heavier in worth than anything she'd ever owned. It couldn't erase the hurt behind them, nor could it guarantee peace in the days ahead, but it was proof. Proof that she and the baby now belonged to a home, a family, with a name. On the way back, the wind carried the scent of pine resin and damp earth. Cade guided the horses, glancing at her now and then with a calmness in his gaze that hid something deeper, like a man who had found what he needed to keep and would never let go. When the ranch came into view, Laya knew Thomas wouldn't give up, and the town might still whisper. But now, every attack would have to pass through Cade, her husband, before it reached her, or the child. And in the stillness of the afternoon, for the first time in many months, she felt her heart not only defending itself, but beginning to open toward a real future. Some battles don't begin with gunfire. They begin with stamped papers and eyes set on taking everything from you. They had barely returned from Copper Falls. The wagon wheels hardly cooled when 3 men were already standing at the ranch gate. The late afternoon sun poured gold over the grass, but the air was thick, heavy, like before a storm. Thomas Whitmore stood in the middle, tall and lean, but no longer the river-smiling boy she once knew. His face was set like stone, his eyes full of claim. To his right stood a man in a black suit, clearly a lawyer clutching a thick case file. To his left was Mayor Hutchkins, heavy-set, his expression unreadable, but his presence alone made it clear this wasn't a private visit. Cade stepped down first, placing himself squarely between them and Laya. "What do you want?" His voice was low and steady. Thomas took half a step forward, locking his gaze on Laya as if to cut through every inch between them. "I want what's rightfully mine," he said. "You rushed into a marriage to dodge the law, but that won't stop me from taking my child back." Laya's fingers tightened in her skirt. "A child isn't something you take back, Thomas. You left for 8 months without a word. You forfeited that right a long time ago." The lawyer cut in his tone, even and cold. "We've filed a case with the county court. Mr. Whitmore is suing for fraudulent marriage, seeking to annul the certificate just issued, and requesting full custody upon the child's birth. We have witnesses and the support of local authorities." Laya glanced at Mayor Hutchkins, who stood silent, only giving a slight shrug, as if he were merely a spectator. But she knew he was the one who had once advised her father to hand her over to Cade. His silence now felt like an admission that the scales were tipping toward Thomas. Cade didn't move. "You have no right to step onto this land with threats," he said. "If you want a fight, we'll meet you in court. We're not running." Thomas's mouth tightened, his gaze sweeping over the place as if memorizing every detail of where Laya now lived. "The court will hear me," he said with certainty. "You'll leave this place and I'll take my child back where it belongs." Belongs? Laya let out a short laugh, edged with fury. A man who walked away the moment he heard he'd be a father, now returning only for pride and possession. That's not where a child belongs. Silence settled, broken only by the wind dragging across the open field. Thomas shoved his hands into his pockets and gave a small nod to the lawyer. The man pulled a set of papers from his case and held them out toward Cade. "Summons. 2 weeks from now, Copper Falls County Court. If you don't appear, judgment will be made in absentia." Cade took it, scanned the lines, then handed it to Laya. The bold print seemed to press the air from her lungs. Fraudulent marriage, petition for annulment, custody rights. Each phrase was a blade, and together they formed a full assault. Thomas turned without another word. "See you in court," he said over his shoulder, before riding away with his lawyer and the mayor, the weight of their horses' hooves thudding against the dry ground. When the yard returned to silence, Laya still stood holding the papers, crumpling them in her grip. Cade stepped closer, resting a hand on her shoulder. "They want to push us back, but we won't," he said. 2 weeks enough to prepare." Inside her, fear and anger tangled together, but beneath them was a steady core. This time she wasn't the girl sent to a stranger's home without a say. She was Cade Rollins' wife, the mother of this child, and she would walk into that courtroom not to plead, but to hold on to what no one had the right to take. The sunset spread over the ranch, casting their shadows long across the ground. The wind carried a chill that hinted at a coming storm, but inside Laya a fire had been lit from the moment Thomas rode away, and it would burn until the day she stood before Judge Harrison again. Not to ask for recognition this time, but to prove that love and honor could not be erased by a court's seal. Some truths must be spoken in the most public of places, at the very moment when no one can hide from them anymore. On the day of the trial, Copper Falls wore a formality it didn't usually have. Along Main Street, townsfolk clustered in small groups, whispering about the case everyone knew would stir the whole community. Inside the county courthouse, the room was packed, not only with witnesses and those directly involved, but with townspeople squeezing into the benches to watch. Laya sat beside Cade at the defense table, her hands resting on her belly now full and round, feeling every movement of the baby within. Thomas sat across from them, suit-pressed eyes cold and proud. Beside him, his lawyer held a thick case file ready to hurl any argument that could tear down Laya and Cade's marriage. The hearing began with Judge Harrison's voice calm, steady, and carrying weight. The plaintiff's side opened with accusations, a rushed marriage to avoid scandal, Cade taking advantage of Laya's situation to claim the title of husband, and most of all, that Thomas, as the biological father, must be granted custody. Each phrase fell like a hammer on Cade's honor, but he sat still, his gaze fixed only on Laya, as though her composure mattered more than his defense. Cade's lawyer countered with the truth that Thomas had abandoned Laya for 8 months, offering neither support nor contact, and had only reappeared when another man had stepped in to protect her. Witnesses came forward, neighbors, the doctor, and those who had seen Cade care for Laya from her very first days at the ranch. The air in the room seemed to stretch taut with each exchange. Laya listened, her heart pounding, when a sudden sharp pain gripped her. She shifted, breathing deep, trying to hold it back, but minutes later a stronger contraction hit. Cade leaned close at once. "Laya." She gripped his hand. "I think it's time." A murmur swept through the crowd, and Judge Harrison tapped his gavel for order. But before he could pause the proceedings, a voice rose from the back, deep, clear, unwavering. "Wait, Your Honor. I have something to say." Every head turned. Reverend Isaiah Mercer, Laya's father, stood there, his broad shoulders slightly stooped as if under a long-carried weight. He stepped forward into the open under the startled eyes of the whole room, including Laya's. All this time he began slow but resolute. "I let pride and fear of gossip guide me. When my daughter needed me most, I turned my back, handed her to a stranger because I thought it would protect my reputation. But the truth is, it was Cade Rollins who did what a father should have done. He protected her, cared for her, kept her safe. I was wrong." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Isaiah went on his eyes on the judge. "I testify here that their marriage is real. Cade never took advantage, he only loved her, and wanted to protect her and the child. I ask the court to recognize this, and I ask the community to forgive my failing." In that moment, Laya's pain was nearly eclipsed by something else. A wave of relief and emotion so strong it brought a lump to her throat. She had never imagined her father would speak such words, let alone in front of the entire town. Cade's grip on her hand tightened, his eyes glinting briefly with emotion, though he stayed silent, giving Isaiah a slight nod of gratitude. Judge Harrison inclined his head, then turned to Thomas. "Mr. Whitmore, the evidence and testimony are clear. You abandoned your responsibility and now seek to use bloodline alone to overturn a lawful marriage. The court rejects your petition. The marriage between Cade Rollins and Laya Mercer is hereby recognized as valid and without fraud." The gavel came down with a finality like a drumbeat of freedom. Thomas sat frozen, his mouth pressed into a hard-line defeat in his eyes. Cade helped Laya to her feet, but just as they were about to leave, another wave of pain bent her over. Harrison immediately ordered a nurse, and the crowd parted to let them through. As they made their way out of the courthouse, past faces that now held less suspicion, Laya felt the warmth of Cade's hand in hers, and knew that though labor lay ahead, she had already won something far greater that day. She had reclaimed not only the right to protect her child, but the dignity that no one could ever take from her again. Some new beginnings take root right where the storm has just passed, when the air still smells of rain, but the seeds have already begun to sprout. That night, in the frantic clatter of hooves carrying them from the courthouse to the birthing house, Laya endured the longest, fiercest hours of her life. Cade never once let go of her hand, his eyes steady, as if to say that no matter how rough the waters, he'd be there to carry her to the other shore. Near dawn, as the sky softened to lavender, the first cry of their baby rang out clear and strong, cutting through every doubt and bitterness the world had thrown at them. Elizabeth Sarah Rollins, the name chosen both to honor Laya's mother and to affirm that from this day forward the child would grow up under the roof of a family with deep roots and a rightful name. When the nurse placed the baby in Cade's arms, he bent low and whispered something only his daughter would ever hear. Laya, her eyes blurred with tears, knew in that moment the man before her wasn't just her husband. He was a father in every true and sacred sense of the word. In the days that followed, the little wooden house on Cade's land seemed to change. Morning light streamed through the bedroom window, catching the fine gold strands of Elizabeth's hair as she slept in the wooden cradle Cade had built the winter before. Reverend Isaiah began visiting often, not just to see his granddaughter, but to help Cade mend fences, stoke fires, and sometimes hold Elizabeth so Laya could rest. He didn't speak much about the past, but his eyes, whenever they lingered on his daughter and granddaughter, carried all the apology and gratitude words could never match. The greater surprise came from the town itself. Cold mercy, so long accustomed to viewing life through the narrow frame of gossip, began to soften. The grocer's wife sent over a basket of fresh pies with knitted blankets for the baby. The old cowboys who lingered outside the saloon tipped their hats when Cade passed by with the wagon. Not everyone voiced an apology, but in the West, sometimes a change in the eyes was how people said, "I see you now." That spring, the land behind Cade's home bloomed with wildflowers, small stubborn blossoms pushing up through soil, battered by the winter storms. Laya often sat on the porch with Elizabeth in her arms, letting the baby breathe in the scent of new grass, hear the wind in the fields, and the cluck of hens announcing the morning. To her, the garden wasn't just beautiful. It was proof that from the broken ground of hardship, hope could rise green and radiant. On weekends, Cade would saddle the horses and for a moment set Elizabeth in front of him on the saddle so she could get used to the smell of leather and the wind over the plains. Laya watched them with a peace she once thought she'd never know. From the girl cast out of her father's house to protect his reputation, she now stood as a wife, a mother, and a woman loved without condition. Their story traveled beyond cold mercy, told at family firesides in the way of Western folk tales. Not as a sugar-coated fairy tale, but as a living lesson in courage, love, and choosing to stand for what's right, even when the whole town is watching and whispering. Cade wasn't a prince, and Laya wasn't a fragile princess. They were two ordinary people who fought back against injustice and defended their home. If you've read this far, you've likely been with them from the moment Laya was sent away through threatening letters to that tense showdown in court. And you'll know by now that not every victory is about defeating the enemy. Sometimes it's about holding on to what matters most and finding happiness right in the place where you were tested the hardest. Cade and Laya now have a whole family, but their journey isn't done. In the West, family means more than blood. It's neighbors helping neighbors. It's building a place where a child grows up knowing the worth of honor, fairness, and kindness. Perhaps their next step will be expanding the ranch, inviting former skeptics to share a table, turning today's acceptance into tomorrow's bond. And maybe someday, when Elizabeth is grown, she'll hear this story told by the very people who witnessed it, a story of a spring when the wildflowers bloomed bright, and of how her parents loved each other and fought to keep their home. So she'll understand that happiness is never handed to you. It's earned day by standing firm in the wind and choosing to hold on to each other, no matter what lies ahead. Look out over the fields at sunset where the light turns every wildflower gold, and you'll see that Cade and Laya's story isn't just their own. It's proof that here in this land, love and hope can still take root and flourish, even when sown in the soil of hardship and loss. And maybe we, those who've listened, should keep on standing behind them, so they not only keep their home, but turn it into a light, warm enough to welcome the whole community.